drifting in, and I can do a bit of an introduction, and people really don't necessarily want to hear me anyway, so I'll just commence. So thanks everyone for attending this evening's conversation. We're very proud to host this event, and it's one in a series of events we hold each year. We have a human rights lecture series, and this is something that we've done over the academic year for many years, and have had an array of speakers. So I'd just like to start by introducing myself and the Haldean Society before I just give a brief introduction to Leila and Ife. So the Haldean Society of Socialist Lawyers is an organisation which works with activists and analyses the law from a socialist perspective. And we're very active in the community and with the legal community in terms of the work that we do. As I say, we analyse the law from a socialist perspective, so that tends to involve international work, and we have an international secretary and committee which engages in our analysis of the law, which is in a lot of ways anti-colonialist and anti-imperialist in its conception, and that brings us into contact with a lot of comrades around the world, and we work together where we can to advance peace and socialism with the work that we do from a legal perspective. So tonight's lecture fits within the theme. It's more in the style of a conversation. We have one of our executive members, Ife, who we're very proud of, who founded Black Protest Legal Support in the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter protests. And Ife had already set up the Black Learning and Achievement and Mental Health charity, which campaigns for a decolonized curriculum and provides educational materials on Black history. So Ife has secured for us, and we're very happy that she secured the attendance for this conversation of Leila, who has a great reputation within the anti-racism community for her work with the Institute of Race Relations, and we're very happy in the way in which we're able to engage and learn from her and her experience in the movement, which sadly is necessary now as it was in the past. It is a fight that needs to continue, and we're very proud to show our solidarity with Leila and with all anti-racists in the United Kingdom and internationally. So I think tonight we will have a great conversation, and we're here to learn. And I would just like to also give notice that we have our AGM next week on Tuesday, the 9th of February. So any members that are joining us this evening, you're very welcome to attend that. And we're also running a Defending Environmental Defenders conference in April, which is to support the Extinction Rebellion activists who are being politically persecuted by the police. And we are also running an inquiry into inquiries, which is looking at the nature of systemic injustices in the United Kingdom in the form of the Grenfell inquiry and the undercover policing inquiry. So any attendees who are not members, please look at our website and think about joining. And we are, as it says on the tin, we are the Haldean Society of Socialist Lawyers, and we're very welcoming and non-hierarchical, and we would very much welcome new members who are interested. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Ife, and we can commence this evening. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you for that warm welcome, Declan. So I've created a short slideshow One's got a video in it, and the other rest of the slides are some archival material that Leila has kindly shared with us, particularly around her work with the Race Day Collective. So I'm going to screen share now quickly, and we're going to quickly watch a video just kind of talking about the legacy and, just to kind of set the mood so people understand the time frame we're talking about and what was going on at that time in particular. Let me just get the slides up. So this video is from the London Metropolitan Archives, particularly the Huntley's Archives, and it's a video on YouTube called Race, Revolts and Resistance.
The 1970s saw major cultural and political shifts in Britain, with police brutality, sus laws, and struggles in the labour market, education, and housing for migrant communities. There were also violent racist attacks, which triggered the Southall uprisings in 1979. Between 1977 and 79, Bogolovachaw Bookshop was targeted by racist and fascist groups, with abusive graffiti daubed on the windows and doors, threatening calls from the Ku Klux Klan and National Front literature and excrement pushed through the letterbox. Other bookshops were also targeted, including New Beacon, Head Start, Grassroots, the Other Bookshop, and Centerprise, as well as in Nottingham, Manchester, and Birmingham. The Huntleys joined forces with other bookshops and formed the Bookshop Joint Action Group, which eventually resulted in national media coverage that forced the police to take action. At this moment, Black was a politically inclusive term that many African Caribbean, African, Southeast Asian, and Turkish groups made alliances with each other. Bogolovachaw, New Beacon Books, and the Race Today Collective mobilized in response to the New Cross massacre, when 13 young Black people died in a firebomb attack in 1981. This was also the moment of radical Black politics, Pan-Africanism, when writers and intellectuals were engaged in political activism, as reflected in a number of journals and independent publications, such as Race and Class, New Left Review, and Race Today, who critically engaged with issues affecting the Black communities that were often misrepresented in the mainstream media. Disaffected youth would rise up in Brixton, 1981, which spread to other inner city areas across the UK. Other uprisings would take place in 1985 and 2011. This social climate gave birth to a cultural revolution in the arts by Black practitioners born or who grew up in Britain. The Keskadee Centre from 1971 to 1992 was Britain's first arts and cultural centre for the Black communities, and was the vision of the Guyanese-born architect and cultural activist, Oscar Abrahams, and was located at 1 Gifford Street, Islington, London.
So just a quick overview, particularly around the time that a lot of the work that Leila was involved in was happening. So I just wanted to play that quickly. And then there's some material that I wanted to showcase. So this is a picket, particularly to do with a young person that was framed by the police at a time when there was a lot of framings going on in terms of testimonies being forged and faked, and people being forced to sign fake testimonies. So there was a gathering in which the community was supporting George, who was wrongfully accused and found guilty. We also have here some of the work from the Race Day Collective, particularly some of their journals from 1986. And this kind of showcases mainly the Pan-African reach of the Race Day Collective. As you can see, we've got interviews here with Maya Angelou, a one-to-one interview with Nwere, who was the key archive person in terms of creating the Pan-African movement in Tanzania. So he's a really, really big name. And then we've got the International Book Fair as well, which later we'll talk a bit more about, but just to show you the breadth of the Race Day's work and the type of people they were able to document and speak with. And then we've got, again, this idea of local and international organizing. So you've got a reflection here, particularly written by Douglas Howe in 1982, called Brixton Uprisings and the Framing of the Newton Rose Murder, which later we'll talk a bit more about. Then we have, again, Race Today, the Caribbean in Revolt. And this is a 1975 issue, which is really important because at the time you had things like the February Revolution and Revolt in Trinidad and Tobago. And then just after you had the Grenada Revolution in 1979. And it looks at Black Power, particularly at this time, there's a lot of Black Power movements going across the Caribbean. So you've got in Barbados, in Bermuda, in Antigua, a lot of islands are taking up the fort for Black Power. And this is actively seen in the Caribbean at this time. And then you have here this really, really great article from Race Today, again, talking about the battle for West Indian Carnival in Britain and what it took to ensure that the Carnival was kept alive and was a regular occurring event in the UK. Again, we have another protest, particularly outside the courts. So we've got a lot of protests at this time outside of courts. So you've got police court justice, which talks to the fact that there was no justice because it was the courts rubber stamping what the police had said. And then you've got Babylon must fall, which is a term very much used in the Caribbean and particularly across activists in the Black community. The Babylon represents the Western world, particularly the oppressive force of the Western world. And so you've got a picket outside the court here. And again, we have Ian MacDonald, who was someone that was really involved with supporting the Black community in its liberation struggles. And he was the barristers for who we called the Arnold II that were framed in this case. And then we have another rally, but this one is for Douglas Howe, who'd been arrested. And we've got, and it is going for a court trial. And we've got a picketing or an organised march outside of the courthouse. And then again, we have here a UK tribute to James Baldwin in 1988, which was held in Brixton Town Hall, which is really close to my house, which is good. And we have Maya Angelou and Carl Phillips both in attendance. And this is again as far back as 1988, and just kind of showing the breadth and just the range of the international intertwinement of the works, and in terms of who Race Day Collective were working with, and just in terms of the type of connections they had globally in terms of the liberation for Black people. And then lastly, you have this image here of Leila outside of the American Embassy. There's been an organization of a protest against the death of George Jackson. And we see Leila here saluting the protesters, and she then delivers an indictment to America, an indictment of racism against America for all of the things that it's done in terms of suppressing the Black community. So just a bit of context, I will bring up some of these images again when we are talking about specific things. So yes, really, really great work there. Thank you for sharing those documents with me, Leila. So I think we should get right into today's discussion. So the first thing I think would be really, really interesting for everyone to know about was, when did you become engaged with political activism in the UK? And more importantly, how did you become engaged?
Okay, So thank you for that trip down memory lane, Ife, but also thank you very much for this conversation, because I think it's only recently come to light with the Steve McQueen films and some of the other interviews that have taken place about that Black radical movement of the 70s and 80s that was very powerful in Britain, I think from probably 65 to 88, when there was really a very strong resistance and a strong community fight for equal rights and justice in this country, which really has not been written about. And even today, I think Black History Month, if you go in lots of schools in the UK, you'll find that it's the American civil rights movement that's discussed, and very little is known about this. So for that reason, I'm very grateful that you've given me this opportunity. So when did I become engaged with political activism in the UK and how? So as a young woman in the 70s, I lived in East London. I had recently returned from East Africa. My father had taken me to live in Zanzibar as a young woman. And because of the revolution in Zanzibar in '64, I returned to the UK. I returned to UK to live with my white working class mother. My mother worked in a sack factory in Plaistow in East London. My stepfather loaded sugar for Tate and Lyle, which is ironic, of course, in the docks on West India Dock, East India Dock, which are now, of course, is just trendy East London. But the time when I grew up, it was a very poor, very deprived area. And I came to live in East London, and it was at the time of the really first huge waves. I'm not talking about the Windrush generation, the large scale immigration that was coming into the UK, and of course was settling in East London as well, coming to work in the Ford factories in Dagenham and in the service industries. And for me, life was really, really uncomfortable and unhappy, because I had been witness to the anti-colonial struggles in East Africa. I had seen Kenya, Tanganyika as it was, even Zanzibar where I lived, be given power, so-called, by the British. And so I had a very anti-colonialist kind of Pan-Africanist mindset. So I was already politically aware in that sense. And when I came to Britain and realized the hostility and the racism that was going on to immigrants and to Asians and West Indians in this country, my solace was in reading. And for some reason, I read the Daily Telegraph because it had lots of international news. So I was always interested in politics, and began to read a lot of Baldwin, read other literature that was around. But I went to work at the Institute of Race Relations. And at that time, the librarian was someone called Sivanandan. And Siva, under the noses of the structure that ran the Institute, which was very much a colonialist structure. It was Booker Brothers McConnell who were excavating bauxite in Guyana. It was Lonro who had very active gold mining and diamond mining interests in South Africa. They were the kind of people who ran the Institute. But under their very noses, Siva built up a library which contained all the information from all the liberation movements around the world. So I had access to more reading. I went there to work as for the company secretary. We began to discuss with Siva and with other people in the Institute, and with some radical academics who were working in the Institute, people who had come from Sussex, which was quite radical, and some of the researchers, about the radical movements that were going on, particularly in the Third World. Not so much Britain, but very much Mozambique, Angola, Southern Africa, the Chicanos, the Panthers in the States. And so we were having discussions about that. And because Siva had built up this library, the young people from the Black Power movements that were around in the mid-60s and early 70s used to visit the library. And a group from the Black Unity and Freedom Party came to the library, and they just started to talk to me. And they talked to me about what they were doing in England and their fight against the police, and what they believed was what was needed, as we thought then, was a revolution. And so they invited me to a meeting in Deptford. At that time, I lived in Kentish Town, but I went to Deptford, to New Cross Road, to one of their meetings. And after that meeting, I joined the Black Unity and Freedom Party. So that was really my first step into kind of what I would call activism in an organization with a group of young Black people. Many of them had come over as young people from the Caribbean. Some were born here, but many of them had come over at the ages of 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and were going through the British school system, or had. The ages were anything from 16 and the older members were in their 30s. It was a large organisation. It had a branch in Manchester, had a branch in North London. And so I just became a member of the Black Unity and Freedom Party. Like many groups at that time, because it was a time of social upheaval in the world, Black Unity and Freedom Party said it was a Marxist-Leninist Maoist group. And so I had my little red book. It's difficult even now for me to imagine, but I was a carrier of Mao's little red book, and I know about the Prairie Fire and other such things which old Marxists will know about. So that's really how I started in the United Kingdom. From BUFP, of course, and my major activism was in the Race Today collective from 74 to 88. And in the Race Today collective, an organization that was a small organization with a journal, and really Race Today, I would say, was part of the movement that was in transition from an immigrant population to being Black and fighting for rights here and the right to have equal rights and justice in Britain. And we're going to talk more about race today and our politics, so I won't go too much into that. But that's really how I became engaged in politics in the UK.
Thank you for that, Leila. I like the fact that you mentioned Sussex University, because I went there myself, and people often talk about it or being a left-wing leaning or a left sort of university, and it's really, really powerful to hear about. Even, you know, as far back as the 80s and 70s, you had people from that institution that were taking a stance and pushing back. So I think that's really powerful. I thought something that would be really nice to just ask you, kind of piggybacking on what you said, was that you know, when you joined the Institute of Race Relations, did you have any inkling in mind that it was going to be a space where there was a lot of activism going on, or was it that when you got to the space, you then realized there was this undercover world in the library?
No, I didn't realize it before. I went to work at 16. I couldn't stay at school. The racism was too horrendous. And my mother, you know, being the white working class lady she was, said, Leila, it's not what you know, it's who you know, and we don't know anybody. So if you're not going to stay in school, you need to go to work. So I went to work when I was 16 and studied at West Ham College of Further Education to further my education. And when I joined the Institute, my first husband, I'd recently married, and I just wanted a job that was more interesting than the run-of-the-mill jobs. I saw the ad for the Institute in the Daily Telegraph, and I went to work in a secretarial role. And it's only when I got there, met Siva, met some of the researchers there, that I realized that there was something else going on in the Institute, and that in the end, we were going to make great change within that institution itself.
Very powerful, thank you. And it just kind of goes to show the trajectory. I mean, if Leila hadn't gone to Institute of Race Relations, where would we be now? So thank you for that. So the next question I wanted to ask you was, how did the intersect of race and class inform the struggles that you were working with and part of? And you mentioned a bit about growing up in a white working class home as well. So it'd be nice for you to talk about how that informed particularly your politics and the politics of the organizations that you were involved in as well.
So I'm going to jump to Race Today now, because at the Institute, we can talk about that, and I'm happy to take questions. But the Institute was an institution. It was based in Jermyn Street. It was an academic research body, and it was just Siva's kind of cunning and ideology that he allowed all these young people to come in and use the library. But when I joined Race Today had an ideology. We were Jamesians. Darkers has always said he was a Jamesian, and James was a Marxist. So once I joined Race Today, we already had a kind of ideology. Now, not all of us who joined Race Today understood what it was to be a Jamesian or even Marx to that extent, but we had study classes, we had discussions, and through our activism, in terms of what we would and wouldn't do, we began to understand what Race Today stood for. So Race Today had, as an organization, had its guiding principle that its content and practice would be guided by the activity of the black working class. We said what it was saying and doing, and that the working class will always be in the leadership of any struggle. So once we had that as our ideological framework, the intersection between race and class was quite easy for us. We understood. I think the difference between the Black Power movement and the Race Today movement was that Race Today actively studied who the immigrant population was in Britain at that time. We understood that many of the immigrants who had come to Britain were from people who had probably not been involved in industrial activity before. If they came from the Indian subcontinent, many of them were peasants. And for many of the men and women, it was the first time they would have had access to a wage. For those coming from the Caribbean, many Black women came singly from the Caribbean and brought their children over bit by bit and later. So we studied who our community was in study classes and in interviews with people. And once we understood that we came over, and Darcus always used to use the term demoralized and defeated, many people in the Caribbean, Africa and India had hoped that their countries would provide a better future for them after independence. And it's the defeat of the independence movement and the offer by Callaghan, Powell and others to come to Britain to work that attracted so many of them. And they came, as we know, in their thousands to this country. But we understood who they were in the Caribbean. So we didn't believe these people just came alive when they came to Britain. We knew they had a history in the Caribbean. We knew many of them had been involved in independent struggles. Many of them had been against, you know, Massa Day Done was the big chant in Jamaica, against colonialists. So we knew coming here, they came with a kind of consciousness. And when they got to Britain and they were faced with the appalling conditions which immigrants were forced to live in, we also understood that instead of being victims, there was a movement within the community to stop being victims and be protagonists. That first manifested itself in the Black Power movements that I was in, with hundreds of young people up and down the country joining Black Power organizations, producing their own newspapers. By the way, Steve McQueen's latest documentary is going to be about the Black Power movement of that era. So already there was a movement for change within the community, and Race Today situated itself there, right there. Because of James and because of James' ideology, we also understood the relationship between the white working class. And so we knew, as you would say, that we weren't nationalists in the sense that we would not work with white people, but we were very much a Black liberation movement for our own self-determination. And we felt at the stage that the immigrant community was in Britain at that time, it was very important to have a Black organization that published a journal and which articulated its own needs and desires.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's really important to bring to the forefront the fact that these people, particularly in the immigrant communities that were in the UK, they were very much involved with radical activism and anti-colonial movements back home as well. I think sometimes that does get very much left out, particularly me when I was reading about the Hutley's work, Eric and Jessica Hutley. They were really involved with the trade unions back in Guyana. I think sometimes when we talk about Black activism in the UK and the history, that is a slight void in terms of what we remember in terms of the imperialist narratives that, you know, people that were anti-colonial not getting that sort of mentioning, or we're not getting that sort of historical context that can inform how when they came over to this country, they still had that same energy to keep that passion going and to keep that drive to overpower any sort of injustice, even in the UK as well. So thank you for sharing that. My next question actually links very well to what you said. So you mentioned Jameson, but it'd be really good to know what were some of the other compulsory reading texts for the movements that you were part of, and how did this shape your political understanding of the world as well?
Okay, so when you say compulsory, it's difficult because Race Today had study classes. We studied C.L.R. James's Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution. We studied in order for us to be able to interview people in a way that would enable the people themselves to understand their own system of oppression. We did Karl Marx's A Workers' Inquiry. I mean, when Darcus said we were going to study Karl Marx's A Workers' Inquiry, many of us thought, you know, what for and why, but we later understood. But in the Black Power movement and in Race Today, there was a whole desire and a kind of passion to read. So whether it was compulsory or not, we were all reading the same books. So the books we were reading were, of course, C.L.R. James. His The Black Jacobins was the kind of standard text in the Black Power movement. I have to say that everybody read James's Black Jacobins. We read W.E.B. Du Bois in America, his Black Reconstruction. We read African literature. We read Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, Black Skins, White Masks. We read Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Chinua Achebe. And of course, the literature coming from the United States, I would say, had the biggest impact on us. And by that, I mean, of course, the autobiography of Malcolm X, James Baldwin's work, the Seize the Time by Bobby Seale, the Black Panthers book, Angela Davis's Elridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice, and then later the women writers that came to the fore with Shanghai Morrison, Angelou Walker. So although we weren't told you have to read this, our passion and our desire for information, to learn and to have a connection with other movements just drove us to read these things. And of course, the literature that was just coming out of Britain at that time was very early. So Sam Selvin's The Lonely Londoners was something which we read, Andrew Salkey. And the text that we read, although we didn't study, which we felt was very important through C.L.R. James, was Ife Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class. So although not compulsory, definitely a desire and very much an exchange of, have you read, what did you think? That was going on very much at that time.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. I think it really sticks to the idea of reading for the community, reading for the collective. I feel like now when we think about reading, it's always kind of individualized, that you just read in your house and it's just for you personally. But it sounds, you know, very much as if it was a communal attitude that everyone did together, and it was about how we could learn together. I think that's something that we should definitely try to bring back, and not trying to individualize everything, and actually think about we can do collective. I think book clubs do quite well with that, but in terms of even the movement, there needs to be a real push for bringing back study groups. And it's interesting you mentioned Black Jacobins, because just the other day on Twitter, someone was talking about essential Black reading texts, and Black Jacobins came up again. So I think that's going to be one to stand the test of time, definitely. Thank you for sharing those texts, and I hope everyone on the call has been taking notes and starts to read those vital texts.
So I think the final part of your question, which I didn't ask, was how it shaped up my political understanding. So I think reading all of that, it basically enforce really what Race Today believed in, which was that racism was a system linked to colonialism, imperialism and capitalism, and that we were part of the kind of Black and third world liberation struggles against this system of oppression. And these works in different ways kind of reinforce that, some in a more literary way and some in an overtly political way.
Perfect, thank you for sharing that. And that gives a lot of context in terms of what movements you were involved in, and the type of work that you guys were able to do because of the grounding and because you knew about the international aspect and also the localized aspect and the intersect of anti-Blackness and capitalism. So I think that's really powerful.
Should mention Walter Rodney, sorry, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa was also a Bible for the Black Power movement.
Yes, so I would still say Bible now, because when I read it, I was blown away. Just the way he puts everything together and the analysis, it's empowering, it's very empowering. So the next question I have links to a question you mentioned earlier, or response you said earlier, which is that there was a lot of hostility from the white working class in the UK. How did the movements that you were in mitigate against this?
So I think it's important to define hostility, because there's the hostility which was violent and physical, the National Front, far-right groups, and that you can't mitigate against that, you have to fight it. So we have the physical fights that went on in Southall, in East London and in Bradford with the Bradford 12. And of course, the political demonstrations, the massive political demonstration against the National Front in Lewisham, which was important. So I think, you know, when we say there was this hostility, I think we have to be careful about it. There's the hostility of the white working class, many of whom, and I lived through this, believed that basically their jobs were going to be taken away, and that the immigrant force, which it probably was and is, was aimed at undermining their power. And that you can negotiate, you can discuss, you can have a discussion about. There's the hostility where there's no discussion, where it is a fight. And Race Today was active in patrols in East London with Asian youth. We used to patrol the streets because the fascists would come out in the night. They killed somebody, Altab Ali was murdered. So there's that kind of hostility, which is overtly violent. And the only answer to that is to fight back. And then there's the political fight, which are demonstrations, campaigning, publishing, and putting an alternative narrative. But I don't think you mitigate with hostility, you just fight it in different forms.
Thank you for that, Leila. I think it's really important to just talk about the breadth, the different types, one from the state institutions, but also those that were not as violent, and the ones that were just openly in terms of just more hostile in terms of their actions, but not necessarily using violence. I think it's really good to be able to differentiate between the different forums, and then also I think have a reactive response that is workable, particularly around, as you mentioned, having self-defense, because that's really important, because we know, particularly around this time, the amount of firebombs, you know, it was open declared war in our community. So the only way that you can kind of mitigate against that is to stand up for yourself, which is coming from a long history of our communities. We have always taken to using these means to protect ourselves, you know, by, as what Malcolm X says, by any means necessary, we must come together and protect ourselves. Thank you for that. So the next question I have.
The biggest demonstration against, of course, racist activity was the Black People's Day of Action and New Cross, which maybe we should talk about later, and how and why that is so important.
Yes, yes, definitely. Thank you. So I think this is it was covered slightly, but it would be good if you went into it just a little bit more, particularly because we just spoke about the open hostility and the ones that was a bit more reserved, which was how important was it to create racialized spaces, so, you know, Black-led, Black-specific sites of resistance to capitalism and racism?
Okay, so I mean, I know it's the modern language about Black-led and specific sites of resistance to capitalism and racism. So I'm just going to say my interpretation of this. So I think it was, the important thing was we had to define who we were ourselves, and not to be defined by white society and by racists in white society and by even some people on the left in society, who basically either saw us as victims, saw us as people who needed to be educated to understand more about white society. And we immediately said, that is not us. You've got the wrong people if you think we are hewers of wood, drawers of water, and that we really don't know how to look after ourselves. So it was really important to make a stand. And it's also about power, because when you show you have power, then relationships change. And that also really links into a question about white hostility as well, because when you show you have power and you're in a different power dynamic with people who do believe they can come into your community and beat you up, then you change that dynamic. So it was really important for us to define who we were for ourselves, and not to take the definitions that were prevalent in the society at that time. And I kind of sum it up like this: we had radical consciousness, we had a radical perspective, and we were radical in our action. And we went on to create a space for ourselves where we could discuss, define, and analyze our own struggles. And in doing that space, we also were able to be creative. And we created our own drama, our own music, our own plays, all about our own experience, which was shown primarily in Black communities, but which also drew a white audience. So in fighting against it, we were able to build relationships with white society, with the white community on our own terms. And they were able to understand who we were in terms of who we thought we were, rather than in terms of who they thought we were. At that time, there was a lot about Black and white should unite and fight. And we just said no, because it would have been an unequal relationship. Because at that time, many of the radical movements, many of them were quite middle class as well, could not get to grips with independent Black self-organization. That came later down the line. And we were for independent Black self-organization. So that was also a discussion and debate. So that was a debate we held in our pages. That was a debate we held in public forums. So you've got to realize that Race Today were activists around a journal. And in our activism, not only fighting the issues around housing, police brutality on the shop floor, we were also engaged in discourse and in discussion. And we would invite people who didn't agree with us to have a discussion with us, because we wanted to develop the argument and to develop people's consciousness about who we were in Britain at that time. The other thing is we always felt that, and when I say Black, you appreciate, Ife, I'm talking about Black in the political sense as was defined in that video. I know now that that is not the case. So we always believed that Black and Asian people had something specific to contribute, something coming out of our own experience, and it might change the nature of white left-wing organizations and change the nature of the debate that was going on in the left. We always believed that. So that was why we always maintained our autonomy as a Black organization based in Brixton.
Yeah, I think that speaks to a lot of things, particularly around the rejection of the idea of Blackness in the white majority and the white normative worldview, which is, you know, that of lack of agency, the need for white paternalism, and all the kind of concepts. I think it's, you know, really important for us as Black people rejecting the history of racism, white supremacy, to be able to have agency on our own narratives, agency on how we want things to go forward, and agency on our own liberation. And I think, you know, part of being able to create our own art forms, create our own spaces which we deem valuable and which represent our culture, is part of the resistance against racism and Eurocentricity, which positions whiteness as the most important. So I think that's a really powerful stance that we must take as Black people fighting back against racism and white supremacy. The next question I have is slightly different, but it's more about the scandal of the UK spy cops. So the UK spy cops scandal has finally come to light. Looking back as activists, did you have any inkling that the state had created the Black Power desk to spy, disrupt and weaken the Black movements in the UK?
So, of course, the Black Power desk has only recently come to light, and I think Darcus's biographers, Robin and Paul, were the people who I think brought this to attention when they were doing research for Darcus's biography, and now there's been more information about it. And then recently, the fact that there were undercover agents in the organization I belong to, the Black Unity and Freedom Party. So what I would say is that we were always aware that we were being infiltrated, and always aware that sometimes, like in Black America, sometimes the differences between groups were being exacerbated by different individuals. And whether those individuals were agents who were encouraging discord and disharmony, and the answer is probably yes, they were, is something now that we can reflect on. But we were always wary of infiltration in our organization. In terms of weakening the movement, I mean, Darcus himself was arrested 6 times. 5 times he was found not guilty. We had our crack justice team then, Gareth Pearce, Ian MacDonald, Mike Mansfield. I mean, we had, maybe we can talk about Race Today and its approach to issues of court cases, the defendant being central, and how we were able to galvanize radical lawyers to our side to fight the cases that we did. But Darcus himself Darcus had his own special branch officers. One was called Inspector Judge. They, particularly around the time of New Cross, they followed him everywhere. He went to cricket, they followed him to cricket. When he asked them why they were at cricket, because we recognized them, we took photographs of them, and he said, I'm at cricket. And they just said, Darcus, we've been told to follow you everywhere. So yes, it was something we were aware of. The extent to which they sowed disharmony and discord within our movements, I think, will only come out later. But no, we weren't aware that there was an actual Black Power desk, but certainly very wary of the infiltration for our organizations, most definitely.
Yeah, and I think you've drawn to light just the scope and the breadth of the means the state were going to use to try and crush a Black liberation movement, particularly in terms of harassing leaders. And because, you know, once the leadership falls, it's so much easier for the rest of the movement to fall with it. So we can see state targeted harassment and infiltration to disrupt the movements, which they weren't able to successfully. But we can see that it did obviously affect the trajectory of the movement as a whole, which is very unfortunate. But I think it's something that activists have to be aware of. And then there's even a recent book that came up, particularly around state surveillance. I think it was, I can't remember who published it at the moment, but I will try and when I do find it, hopefully it can be sent around to people to find out more about it. But it is something that is a big issue, and we've seen it come up again in the spy cops inquiry, particularly seeing how agents of the state were willing to by any means infiltrate groups, but then also the extent to which they did that in terms of sleeping with people, creating families and children at the expense of apparently surveilling people when you're actually infiltrating into their lives to sow this disharmony and discord. Yeah. It just kind of shows the nature of the beast that we're working against. The next question I have is, oh, I'm going to need to share my slide again. It's to do particularly around a lot of the activism that was going on around the courts.
Mm-hmm.
Good to share this image. So my question was mainly, at this time, you can see there's a lot of campaigns, a lot of justice campaigns, local justice campaigns. It would be good if you tell us a background to these images in particular, and you know how important it was to create justice campaigns for these cases as well.
Okay, so the first one I'm going to do is the Royal Courts of Justice. This is Darcus's appeal. So I said Darcus was arrested 6 times and freed 5. On the 6th occasion, Darcus was sent to prison. He was sent to prison. The judge told him he was a very arrogant man. And this absolutely stunned us, because up until then, we had a well-worn formula, which I've mentioned, and Ian's name is there, with Gareth, with Ian, with other radical lawyers in Garden Court and Helena Kennedy and other people, where we had a formula where we had been pretty successful in fighting police corruption, police brutality, and the framing of police, of members of the Black community. And we had had a series of victories where we had got people off. And Darcus had been successful in this, in all his cases, but on this occasion, he was not successful. And this was to do with him having a fight with a barrister at a ticket station in Knightsbridge. And we did our normal, the defense. Darcus himself wasn't physically well at the time. I think he had the flu or something. But he was as combative as always. And the judge just told him, you are a very arrogant man and I'm going to send you to prison, which he did for 3 months. And this rally is the rally which outside the Royal Courts of Justice for his appeal, which was successful. So although he was sentenced to 3 months imprisonment, he was freed within a week. We mounted a huge campaign, an international campaign. I mean, I will tell you the story. We were utterly stunned that Darcus had been sent to prison, and it was doom and gloom, and we went back to the office, and I think we had meetings of the Darcus Howe Action Committee, because we always had a Darcus Howe Action Committee, because he was always being arrested by the police. And I went to visit him in jail. I think Ian told me that he wanted to see me in jail and that I should take him some brandy. And in those days you could. So I smuggled him in some brandy and sat down in front of him, and he was in his prison blues, denim, I think Pentonville had at the time, with a striped shirt, and was very tearful and unhappy. And I remember him looking at me and saying, "What's wrong?" And I said, "Oh, well, they've sent you to jail, and you know, normal." And he said, "But you know what you have to do. You know what we have to do." And I understood completely, and it was to get him out of there and to mount a campaign. And we had messages from all over the world, from the United States, many from the Caribbean, from our contacts in Africa, who wrote to the Lord Chancellor. And when Darcus was in jail, we picketed Pentonville Prison every single night with his family, with his daughters and his sons outside Pentonville every single day. And we were successful in freeing him within a week. And so this is the Darcus Howe rally, and the photograph that you don't see is us being successful and him walking out of the courts and then being mounted on somebody's shoulder. So that's one I remember very well. This one in Bradford Black, the Arndale 2. So this one, although I sent it to you, I would imagine that it's around Black youth again. And Race Today's 14 years of activism is characterized by many, many cases of us fighting with the community against police malpractice, whether it was framing of police, whether it was the beating up of by the police for no reason, whether it was trumped up charges, as in the case of George Linder, who was framed for armed robbery, and the the policeman in the case was found forging statements in the Ripper case. And so George, although he'd been sent to prison, was then freed on appeal and given compensation. Much of our time as activists was spent in and around courts and around getting justice for young Black men and young Black women who've been framed by the police. So in this one, the Arndale, it would have been in with the Bradford Black Collective, which was a sister organisation to Race Today. And I really don't know the detail of it, so you'd have to, George Linder I can talk more about than this one, although I can see that they probably, some were found guilty and some were dismissed.
Yes. Yeah, okay, happy for us to talk about George Linder quickly before I move on to the next
George
question.
Linder,
that'll be good.
Yeah, this was a major campaign for Race Today, and it's also the previous picture you showed of the Black Parents Movement banner. That's also a demonstration for George. So here in this one, you can see George's mother. She's carrying the banner saying George is innocent. And of course, his wife, Carol, who's got the one, my husband suffers and so do I. So Linton wrote a poem about George Linder because George was a working class man who lived in Leeds, and he liked to put on a bet. He liked to go to the bookies. And there was some interaction with him and a police officer, and the police officer arrested him and falsified his statement, and George was charged with armed robbery. They said he'd tried to rob the betting shop. And we, with the Bradford Black Collective and our other people in Leeds and Manchester, mounted a huge campaign for George Linder, because at that time in Bradford, the West Indian community was very tight, very organised and very militant. And so with the family, friends, and with the Bradford Black Collective, we used to travel to Bradford and then later to Leeds, because he was found guilty and he was sent to prison. He went to Armley Prison. And so we never stopped campaigning for George Linder. And as I say, he got his freedom because the police was found to be carrying out dodgy practices in another case. And so that's the George Linder case, with meetings and mobilisation in Bradford, in Leeds, in Manchester, demanding that George be freed.
I think this really speaks to the nationalised efforts and work of Race Today as well, in terms of ensuring that, you know, no Black community was left out. Wherever there was a strong presence of Black communities or Black peoples, there was a Race Today collective branch or an alternative organisation in which was able to support and show solidarity with. I think that's really, really important to talk about some of these national stories, because sometimes everything becomes very London-centric. But I think obviously, because most of us are from London, we kind of focus on London, but there was a whole movement all around the UK, and it's important to recognise and give homage to that as well. My next question falls into the idea of the campaigning work as well. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to know a bit more about how you was able to replicate these localized justice campaigns to an international one. So we can see, particularly with the George Jackson one, that would be classed as an international one, and there's one for Walter Rodney. So how was you able to galvanize the international support as well, particularly for cases and organizing on that as well?
So I think the important thing to remember is that it was an immigrant population that had come to Britain with connections with their home country. So there was an organic relationship between those who had settled here and those who had stayed in the Caribbean, who had stayed in Africa, and who had stayed in India. So it wasn't as if we had to do any work in order to, when I say any work, it was a kind of international solidarity which we felt. So again, it's the era in which we lived. You could come to Race Today and you could meet Walter Rodney, you could meet Maurice Bishop, you could meet intellectuals from South Africa, activists from South Africa. I mean, we had the added bonus that CLR James spent the last 10 years of his life with us. So all manner of activists from all over the world would visit Race Today offices, from Brazil, from South Africa, from India, from West Africa, who wanted to visit CLR. Side by side with that, because there was an organic relationship between those who had left those colonial countries and come to settle in Britain, it really wasn't difficult to do at all. So the Guyanese population who had left Guyana and were against the rule of Forbes Barnum, who later imprisoned Walter and killed Walter, or Jamaica, where I think Bustamante was in power and they Walter Rodney from the university, we felt that as if it was our struggle. We didn't really have any difficulty in saying this was a national or this was an international struggle. Our kind of organic relationships, our connections with these centers of resistance in Africa, in the third world, meant that we could campaign for them with as much ease as we could against the police brutality on the streets of Brixton.
Thank you for that. I think particularly for someone like me looking at activism now, I think there are movements that are becoming like BLM, which is becoming a real strong force for Black internationalism. But I think because we don't necessarily have that direct connection to the continent anymore, some of us are like 4 or 5 generations removed.
Yeah,
it's very hard for us to know what's going on. But I have seen, particularly with like the End SARS campaign, there is a new awakening, I would say, or a new reconnecting to thinking about third world struggles and how we can, as people of the diaspora, get involved and support our communities around the world. So I think that's really powerful to know how you were able to do that back then, and to think about how going forward as young people campaigning against imperialism, colonialism, and the effects of white supremacy, how we can push forward and create international campaigns as well. So thank you.
So Ife, when I speak, people talk to me a lot about this internationalism. And what I noticed recently was when there were the shootings in Nigeria, there were demonstrations by young Nigerians and other people on the streets of London. So you can see again that reawakening of that connection, that although it's not as direct as it was when I was young and when we were growing up, and it was just one generation away, as you say now, it's 3, 4, and 5 generations away. That connection is happening again, because people do go backwards and forwards to the countries that their grandparents came from. So that connection is certainly growing again. And of course,
and I think social media is helping as well, because you can see in real time what's going on, what's happening, and then have an instant reaction.
Yeah.
So
I think BLM with George Floyd again, and that whole movement in support of what was going on in the United States, that again is that internationalism coming to the fore again.
Yes, most definitely. The next question I was going to ask is that African descended populations across spatial, linguistic, and cultural boundaries are not defined by borders of nations when it comes to collective liberation struggles. How did this assist your work when you was doing it, and particularly the work that Race Today Collective did as well?
So in terms of, I've already sort of talked about our international outreach, and you've shown some of the covers. So we would cover a shooting in Dominica as much as we would cover a shooting, say, in Mossad. I mean, that interconnectedness we had already, and particularly through Darkus and Farouk and Linton and members of our collective who had very strong links to the countries from which they had come, and very strong ties with radicals in those countries. So that was something which really we did with ease. I think through the book fair, through the International Book Fair of Radical Black and Third World Books, where that was a gathering where we brought publishers and writers, cultural activists from all over the world. That was something which was truly international, not only in terms of the African diaspora, but European, Indian as well. And the book fairs and the kind of development of the book fairs is something, again, which really encompasses the internationalism that at that time Race Today, New Beacon, Race Today, we called ourselves the Alliance, felt in terms of those countries of origin. So there's never really been a difficulty like we must do this because it's over there. It was part and parcel of the same movement for us, which is difficult to understand now, but there certainly was that organic connection for us, most definitely.
Yeah, that's powerful. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think it is difficult to put together, because I think now, even though we have so much technology, we're only just building up our international connections, whereas there was no technology, but yet there was still able to have such an amassed global reach in terms of on the African continent, in the Caribbean, Asia, even though there wasn't technology, there was still that connection. I think for us, it's so hard to imagine how the organizing would have gone. You had to obviously write letters to each other to invite people over, isn't it?
It was the telephone.
Oh, telephone.
It was the telephone, and it was writing, yes, getting letters. Yeah, Race Today's letterbox would be full with letters with people informing us of all sorts of things.
Wow.
We would get poetry, music, people would write to us with all sorts, and we would just get it through a letterbox. and read it and then write back. Yeah, that was our communication. I mean, I must say, when I speak, a lot of people ask how this was done without social media. How did you do it? But we did. But we had a passion. And when you're actively involved in changing your own reality, as we were, when you're kind of saying, you know, we are on the move, then you will do, these things come to with ease to you. It was not a problem to be on the phone for an hour speaking to Walter Rodney in Guyana, or hearing the latest development with the Black Consciousness movement with Steve Biko in Southern Africa. These were things we did.
Powerful. Thank you. So my last question to you before I open to the floor for anyone to ask any questions is, what was your most memorable creation in terms of, I know you did a lot of work in cultural events and you had the Creation for Liberation event. So what was your most memorable Creation for Liberation cultural event, and why?
So, well, I think you've seen it. So for me personally, the first person I read that really meant something to me was James Baldwin, who really made me understand, although he was talking about America, about race, racism, relationships with white people, and what it is you had to do. So Baldwin was always someone who meant something a great deal to me. When he died, there was a young man called Carlisle Phillips, who's a writer and here, and he was also very influenced by Baldwin and thing. And when we were in the offices and we said Baldwin had died, we said we should have a tribute to him, because we accepted that before the sort of later spate of writers in the 80s, in the 60s and the 70s, it was Baldwin who, with courage and fearlessness, challenge white racist power structures in America and white racism in America. So we wanted to honor him. And as it was at that time, because Race Today's reach was in the United States, we were in all the universities in the United States, we're activists in the United States. Basically, we telephoned Maya Angelou. We got a number for Maya Angelou, and we called Maya and we said, we want to do this tribute to James Baldwin. Would you come over and do it? And she immediately said yes. I mean, that's how it was. And Maya came to Brixton Town Hall, and that was major for Brixton, major for us all. And of course, it was packed out. The queues to get in, we could not fit everybody in. It was mayhem. Those days, the council wasn't afraid. Now I expect the council would call the police if they saw that number of Black people gathering outside a building. But in those days, we were able to gather. We let in standing room, sitting room only. And Maya was a raconteur, and she delivered the most amazing kind of monologue and discussion about, with humor, with love, stories about James Baldwin, which was just really out of this world. It was just a fantastic evening. So that stands out for me. I would say for the book fair for Creation for Liberation as well, one of the most electrifying moments for us has been the Jamaican poet Mikey Smith. When Mikey Smith got on that stage, and many of us hadn't heard of Mikey Smith, Linton had brought him here. There was another writer whose name escapes me. They were on about this young Jamaican poet called Mikey Smith, who we brought him over to England. He stayed with the collective. But when Mikey got up and delivered that poem called Me Can't Believe It, I don't think anybody could believe what they were hearing or seeing. And that, again, is a standout moment. There are many others. We had Amiri Baraka, we've had Jane Cortez, we've had so many people we brought over, Ngugi reading and discussing. I mean, standout moments, really, we've had. And in that sense, I feel very fortunate to have been around at that time and been through that period of my life. Very, very fortunate.
Yes, I think it's so nice to kind of hear that international links, because for me, I love Maya Angelou, I love her work, and to hear that she was, in the UK in Brixton, when we learn about her, I went to school next to Brixton. We never even heard about the fact that she traveled to the UK and delivered this amazing monologue when she took part in this movement. So I think it's really sad that this narrative is being left out. But I think by doing this sort of discussions, we can, get the word out there, but also reflect on just the power of the work that we've been doing in the UK. And I think that goes very much unnoticed. And it does sound like that event was amazing. And I think I agree with you as well when you were mentioning how now the council would probably not, I mean, obviously Corona as well, but I mean, before, I think I think the council, yeah, would definitely take an issue to see such an event now. But it sounds like, you know, that back then there was a lot more autonomy and a lot more the community was able to do in terms of organising. So that's very powerful. I think.
Sorry, Ife, we know this because when we wanted to organise a memorial for Darkers in Brixton, the Lambeth Town Hall would not allow us to have a public event. It had to be by invitation only. They would not allow us to publicise it because they were afraid of the numbers of people who would turn up, and they felt that there'd be crowd control issues. So we know this for a fact that these things just don't happen now in this way.
Yeah, and it's a shame. It's definitely a shame. I think I want to ask you one more question because I haven't had anything come in the chat as of yet, but I really like the story of how you was able to acquire the building at Race Today building in Brixton. I think it'd be nice if you share with everyone as well.
Okay, so Race Today, we squatted. So the story is that the institute became radicalized, and the institute itself moved from Jermyn Street to Leek Street in Islington. And it also got rid of the Colonial Council and asked Wilfred Wood, who was the Bishop of Croydon, and John LaRose to be, John was the director, Wilfred was the chairman. And in discussions with Siva and with other people who'd been active in changing the institute, it was said that the Race Today, which existed already as a journal, needed a black editor. And there were 3 people in the running for this job. I think Darcus Howe, Ron Phillips, and a guy called Hal Austin. And they talked to them, and Darcus told them he would only be interviewed if he was assured that he would get the job. He was not prepared to go through any selection. But if they wanted him to be editor, then he would go through an interview process, but only if he was guaranteed to get the job, which of course he did. And Darcus, in discussion with CLR and Selma James and people at that time, wanted to build an independent black organization. I knew that we had to move to be in the black community. And Brixton at that time, there was a large squatting movement and a black squatting movement because the council had put compulsory purchases orders on the houses. And this is where you can only sell to the council. And so they said they wanted to build a motorway that was going to go from, I don't know, Brixton to Brighton, and it was going to cut through a whole swathe of houses. And so therefore, they wanted people out of the houses. And so what you had was a lot of empty properties in Brixton that were in good nick. And so Olive Morris, who was active in the squatting movement at that time, and was also in the Panthers with Darcus. So we knew Olive, and we would chat and see each other. And when Darcus said he wanted to move, she just said, well, come to Brixton. You can easily get something in Brixton. So we first moved everything to Farouk's house, which was a squat on Melton Road. And then we selected our houses. We walked down Mel Road, we walked up Shakespeare Road. The house that Darcus and I eventually lived in was a squat. So we squatted one on Mel Road, and we squatted 74 Shakespeare Road. And then, and when I say squatted, what you did then was you broke the lock on the door, changed the lock on the door and just moved in. It was as simple as that. And then you negotiated with the council, the gas board and the electricity board, so you could get your amenities. And then the council would visit us. And then we moved into 74 Shakespeare Road. We made friends with the lady who owned the building next door, who was a lace maker. And she said, when I leave, it was a council property as well, I'll let you know so you can move in here. So when she left, we broke through the inner door, the inner wall of the 2 adjoining buildings, and we squatted that building as well. So that was Race Today's home, 165 Relton Road eventually, but it was on the corner of 74 Shakespeare, and both were squats, and then later negotiated with the council. And then with Ken Livingston and the GLC, we were able to develop the buildings and have a proper production house to produce the journal. And also we were able to do the flat where CLR James was able to come and live with us.
Wonderful, thank you for sharing that. I think all too often we hear about the squatting movement, we don't hear about the stories of the black squatters and what that meant particularly for Brixton. But thank you for sharing that. So we've got quite a few questions in the chat. I'm going to start with the shortest question I've seen first, which is from someone called Joanne, and she says that, Leila, do you plan on publishing your own political biography?
I don't know about political biography. I mean, I have had an offer to write my story, just to tell my story, and it's something I'm considering, but I don't know that I'll ever do it. But thank you, Joanne.
Well, you have to give the people what they want, Leila. I think, and I'm supporting this question as well. So we'll leave that with you, but we will tell you what we're like, what we would like.
Okay.
So we've got another question here, which is someone saying, thank you for discussion. It's been really fascinating. Their question is particularly around social media. So one of the benefits to activists today is on social media, people are connecting all over the globe. But in another way, social media can be overwhelming in terms of information overload that it can induce, particularly feelings of powerlessness and at best, powerless at best and cynicism at worst. I think that learning to prioritize limited resources might be a good antidote to this. In terms of managing international, national and local activism, how did you prioritize what Race Today would focus on?
Okay, so I don't know that we did prioritize. We kind of had our aims and we knew what we stood for. So if somebody came, a mother came in and said, my son's just been beaten up by the police and gone to Brixton Station, then one of us who was in the office or around would just go to Brixton Station. We would just get up and we would just go. I mean, there was myself, Loreen, Jean, Pat, Darkus, Farouk, whoever was there, we would just get up and go. But in terms of what we published and the discussion we had an editorial board, and that was thought about, that what we published and why we published it and the issues that we decided to highlight, that was made by an editorial board that met regularly in the offices. If I had kind of described Race Today to you, we would get there maybe 10 or 11 in the morning and leave the next morning at 3 and 4. And all the time, in whatever we were doing, there would be discussion. It could be more of an ideological discussion. It could be a discussion about a campaign. It could be a discussion about the news. But we said, and this is where perhaps social media is, I wouldn't say a barrier, but this might be one of the differences. We as people would meet and discuss all the time. We didn't always agree. We had quite really, strong arguments, but all the time we had an ongoing debate and discussion, and that informed what we would do and what we felt we should cover. But in terms of the content of the journal, that was decided by an editorial board, and that was informed by what was going on, what we felt we ought to intervene in, what statements we had to make, and that was part of a discussion we would have on a daily basis. We were always clarifying. We were always, wanting more to understand more about what was going on and what we could do about it.
Thank you for that. The next question is from someone anonymous, and it says that, should we be building statues and memorials of important figures like Olive Morris, Leila Howe, and Savianda to replace the ones we hope to tear down, or does this play into an unhelpful and potentially dangerous narrative?
I know Lambeth itself is having a consultation about renaming roads, statues and everything. There is a movement already that wants to do this. And because I participated in one of the open forums that Lambeth had, and I was just amazed at the number of street names, buildings, monuments that had been erected that had a relationship with slavery and colonialism. So this is a massive piece of work. I mean, personally, of course, I would like some kind of memorial, a road named after Darkus, because his contribution, I think, really, and because of his radical stance and the fact that Darkus never ever once conceded or, what can I say, compromised. Darkus was not a compromiser. For those reasons alone, I would like some kind of permanent memorial to him. And I have approached Lambeth myself to say that there should be some kind of either a street or something for him. But in terms of whether it should be a statue, I don't know. I prefer a mural. I think I don't really have a strong view either way, but I think something more radical than statues, or something different we could think about in terms of how we pay tribute to the people who really had a huge contribution to the development of our society.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think it's important to give honour where honour is due, particularly for localised histories that have been left out, and particularly histories that are important to our communities that are all too often omitted from the mainstream narrative. I think having it in particularly spaces like Brixton, which has been such an important space to the Black community, is really, really important. We've got another question here by someone called Rana. She asks that this event has been fascinating, and it's been amazing learning about your inspiring work, Leila, and the lessons that we can learn going forward. What are your thoughts on the use of the BAME, so Black and Asian Ethnic Minority acronym? Recently, there has been conversations around the usefulness of grouping all other ethnic minorities together. Do you think the term is helpful or not? And what are your thoughts on this?
I hate the term. I absolutely hate the term BAME. I don't know. It's probably been devised by some kind of local council or some sort of institution.
Yeah, it's government. It's a government word.
No, I hate the term. I know that, you know, I do some part-time work in Croydon, and they to have a BAME forum. I just think it should be called the Equality Forum. So in terms of BAME, no, I don't like it at all. What is minority ethnic anyway? I mean, no, I don't like it at all. I'm not for it. Yes,
I second that as well, Leila. We have another question here. So Joanna asking again, can you shed some light on Ira O'Fately? Her name has come up in talks and books about the Black Power movement, but there's nothing online.
So I think Ira, if I'm right, was a member of the Black Panthers. So I don't know if his name was Flaherty, but I do know Brother Ira, as we were all sisters and brothers in the Black Power movement. And Brother Ira most definitely was a member of the Panthers, the Brixton Black Panthers. And he would have been around the time of Eddie, Darkus, Farouk, Linton. He would have been in the Black Panther movement at that time. And I knew him, I know Ira. So yeah, that's who Ira, if that's the Ira you're referring to, a member of the Brixton Black Panthers.
Thank you. I think the big issue in the UK is, again, we don't always have enough of the resources out there. So in terms of it being documented, it's not necessarily there. But I would definitely encourage you to, you know, check out the archives. Maybe Brixton Archives or Lambeth Archives may have some more about him, or the National Archives. But again, as Leila mentioned earlier, we don't really get taught enough about these narratives. So all these things are just kind of coming to light now. We've got another question which says that, I found your work very inspirational. How can children of the diaspora learn about their past and need for activism, particularly the small colonies and those outside cities? And do you have hopes for the curriculum about how it can become more inclusive?
One of the things that we did when Darkus died was we published a book around what Race Today did. I mean, there's Darkus's biography, which is also a brilliant insight into that era, but also an anthology of Race Today. And I think that there is very little literature around from that era. And I think Bernadine Evaristo, she's taken it on herself to republish some of the stuff that was around in the period we're talking about. I think she's made a deal with a publishing house. So there will be more coming out. I think that with the Black Lives Matter movement and the fact that so many young Black people in Britain said that this is an issue for us in Britain too, this is not an American phenomenon, I think that's going to be one of the drivers to get more information about what went on before in Britain in terms of the radical movements. I mean, it wasn't just our radical movement, the Indian Workers Associations, many of the Caribbean associations, the West Indian Standing Conference. There's a big history of activism from the immigrant communities that really has not been seen by anybody and is in all sorts of different places. We know we've got the Black Cultural Archives. We know the Institute of Race Relations probably has the best set of the Black Power journals. So it is there, but people have to actively seek it out. So it's in talks like this, in getting our book around, that we're trying to get the message that there is this history, this really rich radical history of the Black community in Britain that we feel could inform future generations. And the second part was, do I have hopes for the curriculum? But I think that was it. Well, I know there's big moves in terms of teaching and wanting to get representative literature, but I know there's also barriers in terms of what the government says you could teach. I think that the mangrove has just been recently introduced in some GCSE, and there's other learning materials now because of Steve McQueen's film about the mangrove. There's a lot of work around that. So yeah, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful. There is a sea change. I mean, there is a change. There is an interest now in what we did as opposed to what went on in America. Definitely.
Yes, and I would definitely echo that, Leila, particularly the work that we're doing with BLAM. We're trying to showcase and put at the forefront Black British narratives, but also Black global narratives that have been omitted. And I think it's important and it's imperative of all of us to see what we can be doing in spaces that we are in, and also joining other organizations that are doing this work and plugging them and ensuring that they are able to deliver support in schools. We need a lot of teacher trainings, because we always say that even if Black history was made mandatory tomorrow, a lot of teachers wouldn't even know where to start, because even them themselves have been going through the same Eurocentric education system that sees it fit to omit and to leave out Black narratives. And another point I thought would be really good to talk about was the book that Leila mentioned, Racist Day Collective. I have it as well. I was at the launch, which was amazing. It was in Brixton again, and it was really good. And it's published by Pluto Press. I would encourage you to go on Pluto Press website and to get the book. It's a game-changing book, and the wealth of history and knowledge in there is amazing, and just the quality of the journal and the topics it covers. You know, there were so many topics that I didn't even think that would be in there, but they were there, and I just really resonated. And every time I open the book, I just smile. So I just thank you for the work that you've done, Leila, and for creating the book so we can still enjoy some of those pieces today. I have another question, which is a lot broader. It talks about the person apologizing if it's a bit too vague, but it says that what are the important differences and continuity between now and the heyday of Race Today? And the person talks that, okay, technology has progressed, rents have increased, and so has prison capacity. But what are some of the continuities that you're seeing between, you know, now and then in the heyday of Race Today?
So, I mean, that's difficult for me because I'm not an activist now. And I do say this to people, that for me to comment on what's going on now, apart from, you know, fleeting interests going on some of the YouTube and hearing the discussion that some young activists are having, I'm not active in any campaign at the moment. My major work is with the Darkest Howe Legacy Collective. We want to digitize Race Today. We want to make race, you know, to make it more accessible to everybody. We've got our book. We've got other projects that we want to do around that. But in terms of political activism, I'm not. And so I'm always really wary to comment on something if I'm not active in it myself, because all it is like, you know, some kind of, you know, academic or armchair theorizing about this and that, which I really don't want to do. All I will say is that the Black Lives Matter movement and the many strands within that movement and the many strands of debate and discussion and the many strands of the different demands that are being made are something which I take great heart from. Great heart. It's social movements that change things. When you're in institutions, you can work hard to work on legislation, to change social policy, to change the law, to change the practice of the law. But when you have a huge social movement and the impact it has, and I was part of a social movement of the Black Power movement, it alters the kind of dynamic of relations. It changes your perception of things. And once again, we've seen that with the Black Lives Matter movement. So in that, I'm really heartened. But in terms of specifics, I can't judge. I hardly use social media myself. I do, you know, a little Facebook account. I'm not active on Twitter. So I think it's really for activists of today to see the strands themselves and to say what they think, rather than for me to say so. I will just say one thing, and I think, you know, I've said it before. When Race Today was active, if something like Bangladeshi girls of 14 and 15 joining ISIS had become an issue, as a collective, we would have gone down there, we would have interviewed the girls, we would have asked them why they wanted to go, we would have interviewed their parents, and we would have made it a community issue and a discussion issue, rather than what it later became as a moral issue, and these girls ending up in really dire situations in refugee camps. And that was something we did physically by, you know, being activists who did. And I think with social media, some of that sometimes gets lost with, there's just so much. And it's what you hone in on and what you develop and what you think will contribute. And that's what, you know, Race Today was good at. We were in East London for 3 years working with Bengalis on the question of housing, and then later anti-racist attacks. So, and it's a different kind of activism now. I'm not saying one was better than the other, but I think it just shows there was a different dynamic at play.
Someone's anonymously asked this question, and it says that what happened to cut this history off from the current struggles. But I think it's really important to remember that the education system in itself is a white space, and in terms of who gets memorialized and what stories get told, has to be stuff that are in line with the status quo or in line with what the state wants to show. So I think in terms of who gets memorialized is very much to do with the US-centric curriculum, and particularly in terms of globally as well. I feel like for the UK, it's a lot easier for them to talk about the US and be that there's a problem of racism in the US as a way to omit and to try and act as if there's nothing here in the UK. But happy for Leila to answer that as well.
So I think, you know, movements ebb and flow. I was part of a movement that we did great things. It was a huge movement, an international movement. And then society changed and people's preoccupations became something else. And what we're seeing now again is a resurgence of that movement. And it's the resurgence of a movement that makes people want to know about their past. When you're doing your day-to-day in the status quo and you're going about your business, it's only if you're an academic or someone with a real interest in history are you going to say this past is relevant. But now we've had a huge social movement again. People do want to know about what went on before. So I think you have to bear in mind that it's the movement again that has created this interest in what's gone on before in terms of politics in Britain.
Yes, I would echo that. I guess unless you're a nerd like me who likes like history and likes reading, you won't go out of your way to find these things. I know that I think there was is there more questions? Well, Liz has said that thank you for maintaining this history because it gives us hope and leadership. It's not out of date and it shows that we can make effective change. And then someone says that they really recommend getting Here to Stay, Here to Fight because it really shows the difference between bad liberal lawyers and radical anti-racist lawyers as well.
Yeah, very true. That's very true. We had some magnificent radical lawyers in and around our movement who were absolutely warrior lawyers who were on our side. Absolutely no hesitation in believing whatever the defendant said and going out to battle in the courts against the police, showing up the police to be liars. I remember Ian did one cross-examination of I think 6 girls who'd been arrested and framed by the police and beaten up. By the time Ian had finished with one of the police officers, he fainted in the dock. He said he couldn't go on. I mean, that was the kind of temper we had, and that kind of taking the fight into the courts was very much something which Race Today, the alliance that we were part of, was very, very clear on. And not doing negotiating and compromising and telling a defendant the best deal is this. It was no, you didn't do it, you've been framed, here we go, we're fighting for you. That was always the spirit of the lawyers who supported us.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to hear about these narratives. I think particularly when looking at the British legal system and what you learn in law school, you're taught to just go with the status quo. You're taught to, you know, just be, you know, not to cause any offense and to go with the flow. So I think it's really important to hear these narratives and just to reflect on how far back they were happening and actually think about how we can bring that to today's activism in the courtroom and activism in general as well. So I think that's it for questions.
I think someone wanted to talk about the curriculum, didn't they? Did I see somebody say he could talk about what's going on in the curriculum? Or did I miss that one? Was it Richard, somebody?
Yes, they wanted to come up on the stage to speak, so I would wait for them to come up. Someone asked for a reference to be made about the authors that Leila made. So yeah, we can between Haldane and I can go through and make a list of some of the names that Leila's mentioned and any other ones that she thinks will be of good use for everyone to read as well. So we're just going to wait for the person to come up to speak.
Is it there? Yeah.
Welcome, Richard.
Hi there, Ife. And Leila, thank you so much for an incredibly inspiring tour de force of a period I remember much of very well, and some of the names that are very familiar. And I was asked by Declan if I could say a few words about what is going on right now in terms of this kind of solidarity work in the United States, that the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, of which the Haldane, of course, is a British chapter, is working together with the National Conference of Black Lawyers, with the National Lawyers Guild in the US, and we have hearings going on every day into the what's called the International Commission of Inquiry on Systemic Racist Police Violence against people of African descent in the United States. And this came together very much around George Floyd and the just appalling responses of the previous American administration, the name of which I won't even utter. But every day for the last 2 weeks and going on until the end of this week, and one of the wonders of modern technology is that we are broadcasting 3 hours a day interviews with the survivors, victims, lawyers for the families of who are victims of police violence in the United States. And the commission is 12 lawyers and judges of African descent themselves, 4 from the Caribbean, one Peter Herbert, Judge Peter Herbert from the UK, and as I say, we have 12 really top flight lawyers who are essentially sitting in judgment of the United States system and will be presenting their report to the UN Commission on Human Rights later this year, when in fact in about 3 months' time. So it's going to be a really hard-hitting report, and these have been some incredible testimonies. And I would invite people, can I put it in the chat here, to themselves listen to some of that testimony. Some of the mothers of the people who have been murdered by the police in the United States with impunity are some of the most powerful testimony I've heard from any source. But you can simply go online and look back over the last 2 weeks and witness for yourselves the testimony that is being given. So thank you for letting me put in that plug for the ongoing work that's continuing. And one book that you didn't mention, Leila, and I know that it's one that is dear to your heart, is Angela Davis's Women, Race and Class, which I think is one of those powerful, eye-opening books that I've ever read. And I think just a fabulous one to put on everyone's reading list if they haven't got around to it yet. Over.
Thank you for that, Richard. As I think that this sums the end of today's discussion, and all good things must come to an end. I want to thank Leila for coming today to share all her wisdom and knowledge of us, and actually just giving us a renewed sense of hope, and also letting us know about so many histories that have remained hidden and stories that haven't been told yet that need to be told. So thank you so much, Leila. And
My pleasure. Thank you.
No problem. So yeah, do follow Haldane on social media and keep up with our work. And this should go on YouTube in a few weeks' time as well. So when you do get a chance, please share with other people so we can keep these stories alive.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all for coming.
Good.